आज के हमारे जो मुख्य वक्ता हैं उनके संक्षिप्त परिचय के साथ मैं उन्हें मंच पर आमंत्रित करना चाहूँगी। भुचुंग डी सोनम सर एक कवि, लेखक व संपादक के रूप में इनकी ख्याति है। सर का जन्म चाइना के सिगाप्से शहर में हुआ था। यानी कि पिछले हमारे साथ जो भी लोग जुड़े पिछले दिनों हमने देखा कि वो एग्जाइल में जन्म लिए थे और उन्होंने निर्वासन के अपने दर्द को हमारे साथ साझा किया था। सर का जन्म 1972 ईस्वी में चाइना के सिगाप्से शहर में हुआ। यानी 59 में जो है वो तिब्बती लोग चाइना से बाहर आए थे निर्वासन में। सर तब भी वहीं थे, उनका जन्म वहीं पे हुआ है। उसके बाद 84 में सर भारत आते हैं और उसके बाद की शायद कहानी वो साझा करेंगे। और यहाँ आने के बाद 84 में जब वो यहाँ आते हैं, लगभग 11 वर्ष की उम्र में, 12 वर्ष की उम्र में जो भी रही, वो धर्मशाला आते हैं। जैसा कि बाकी तिब्बती लोग भी धर्मशाला में रहते हैं, हम जान चुके हैं। तो सर भी यहाँ आए और यहाँ के तिब्बतन चिल्ड्रन विलेज स्कूल में इन्होंने अपनी प्राइमरी एजुकेशन ली। उसके बाद सेंट जेवियर्स कॉलेज अहमदाबाद से सर की आगे की शिक्षा हुई, ग्रेजुएशन की। उसके बाद यूएस सर चले गए और सर की आगे की फिर पढ़ाई वहीं पे हुई है। सर तिब्बती जो शरणार्थी के रूप में कहें या जो चाइना में रहते हुए सिगाप्से शहर में जो इनकी स्मृतियाँ रही जन्म लेने के बाद, वहाँ की जो इन्होंने ग्रो अप किया वहाँ पे, उसको वो सारी चीज़ें इनकी कविता में देखने को मिलती है। जैसा कि मैंने कहा, सर संपादक भी रहे हैं। अभी तक सर की 9 किताबें या तो काव्य संग्रह है या फिर सर ने संपादन किया है। अलग अलग जो तिब्बती मूल के जो कवि या राइटर हैं जो अलग अलग विधाओं में लिख रहे हैं, उनकी रचनाओं का सर ने संपादन किया है। जो किताबें हैं उनके नेम्स इस तरीके से हैं। सर की फर्स्ट किताब है इंडियंस ऑफ तिब्बत नेम से, कॉन्फ्लिक्ट ऑफ डुअलिटी, याक हॉर्न्स, सॉन्ग्स फ्रॉम अ डिस्टेंस, सॉन्ग्स ऑफ द आरू, अंडर द ब्लू स्काई, सॉन्ग्स फ्रॉम डिवाचन। और संपादक जैसा कि मैंने बताया, तो सर ने एक ऑनलाइन प्लेटफॉर्म पे तिब्बती साहित्य का संपादन करने के लिए एक ऑनलाइन प्लेटफॉर्म पे आए वो, जिसका नाम है तिब्बत राइट्स, और इसका एक ऑफशूट है ब्लैकनिक नेम से। और हमें जानकर खुशी होगी कि ये दोनों जो संपादन का काम जिस प्लेटफॉर्म पे होता है उससे तेंजिन सोटू साहब भी जुड़े रहे हैं और अभी भी जुड़े हुए हैं। तो इतने महान व्यक्तित्व को मैं मंच पे आमंत्रित करना चाहूँगी कि अपनी बाकी की जो बातें हैं वो रखेंगे। सर का आज का जो लेक्चर है, जो 10वां सीरीज है, उसका टाइटल है अंडरस्टैंडिंग तिब्बतन लिटरेरी सोर्सेज। तो सर इस पे बातें रखेंगे ही। इसके बाद जैसा कि हम सवाल जवाब से गुजरते हैं तो हम उसके माध्यम से भी बातें जानने की कोशिश करेंगे। धन्यवाद सर।
एक छोटा सा हिंदी इतना अच्छे नहीं कि मैं साहित्य के बारे में बात कर सकूं, इसीलिए मैं अंग्रेजी में बात करना चाहता हूँ। Thank you very much. I wanted to make a few things clear. I am not a scholar. I've never studied literature. I studied economics, both BA and MA. I'm also not a scholar. I never done research on Tibetan literature or writing of any kind. So that's one of the things that I wanted to make clear. And also, as Professor said, I was born in Tibet. Tibet, probably Tundu spoke to you earlier, became a part of China only in 1959 when it occupied Tibet. And before 1959, China never shared any border whatsoever with India for thousands of years. So only in the aftermath of China's occupation of Tibet in 1959, now India shares border with the China. I think it's about 3,000, more than 3,000 kilometers. So that's one of the things that I wanted to make clear. The literary sources is fairly complex, at least to me, because I've never studied, as I said, literature. But I think when you talk about Tibetan literary sources, it's really important because I'll be focusing more on Tibetan English writing. But one just cannot talk about Tibetan English writing without some context, some historical context. So I'll just go into a little bit of to give you a little bit of context on Tibetan literature. I will go into the Tibetan civilization aspect, because any writing, whether it happens here in India or elsewhere, it has to do with the people and the climate and the civilization itself. So a couple of years ago in central Tibet, they found rock art which dates back to, I think, 220,000 years, which makes Tibet one of the oldest civilizations in the world. So beginning from such ancient time till about 1959, we have seen several evolutions regarding aspect of Tibetan expression, particularly writing. So it is believed by and large that Tibetan language that we know, especially the written script, was devised in 7th century, around 7th century, based on several Indian languages, including Pali, Devanagari, and several other written scripts. So, which means that written language that we know, that you know as Tibetan, comes from India in the 7th century. So this has a fundamental impact both in Tibetan expression and also in Tibetan civilization, because along with the devising of Tibetan written script, also Buddhism was introduced to Tibet, which fundamentally changed Tibetan civilization up until 7th to about 9th century. Even before that, Tibetan empire used to cover a whole lot of Central Asia, all the way from, I think, Samarkand, all the way to Xi'an, which is now in China. So that's maybe probably 1/3 of Asia. So anyway, from 7th century, Tibetans started writing, which earlier was purely oral tradition, to about from 7th century till about mid-13th century, Tibetans started writing primarily Buddhist texts, because Buddhism was introduced to Tibet. And then all the literature that we used in that span was largely Buddhist in nature. And then this, if you look at this writing, it has to do with the very intimate Tibetan expression that comes from the Tibetan landscape, from based on people's expression. Then one fundamental thing changed around mid-13th century when one of the Tibetan scholars called Sherab, he translated Mirror of Poetry, which is Kavyalash by Indian writer Dandi. So Dandi happened in maybe 7th, 8th century. So his Kavyalash was translated into Tibetan in the mid-13th century by Tibetan scholar Shundan. And this again fundamentally changed Tibetan writing style, because before that everything was more freestyle. And then also because Buddhism was introduced from Tibet, and then Tibetan scholars were looking towards India for all the inspiration, both religion and otherwise. So this one single book, Kavyadash, translated into Tibet, had a fundamental impact. So from about 13th century, then Tibetan, till about 1959, Tibetan entire corpus, you can say, of Tibetan writing is by and large influenced by Dandi's Kavyadash, which has very strict regimented style. And then if you look at this time span, you can almost say that all the Tibetan scholars were deeply influenced by Dandi's style, which had a deep impact on Tibet's natural expression of things. Because before that, all the great Tibetan writing, including Milarepa, he was 10th century, 11th century Tibetan mystic and scholar, he wrote 100,000 songs. These were written before Kavyadash was translated into Tibetan. So if you compare, let's say, Milarepa's poem written before 13th century and all the other literatures written in the aftermath of the translation of Dandi's Kavyadash, then you can see that there's a really regimented style of writing in Tibetan. So that's then another big change came in 1959 when China occupied Tibet, and then the entirety of Tibetan civilization got upended, because when China invaded Tibet, it sought to destroy everything: Tibetan religion, Tibetan culture, Tibetan way of life, basically everything. So starting from 1959, China started many political campaigns like democratic reform campaigns, Great Leap Forward, during which scholars estimated that 45 million people died in the whole of China, including in Tibet. So you can imagine 45 million people dying in the span of 4 years because of one political campaign. Then also the Cultural Revolution happened from 1966 to 1976, in the 10 years, during which they initiated destruction of all walls, old culture, old habit, old wisdom, and old way of life, which means for countries like Tibet and China, which are ancient civilizations, when you say everything all has to be destroyed, there was nothing left. In China, for example, these days China promotes Confucius Institute, but in the height of Cultural Revolution, they even dug out Confucius' grave and destroyed that. You no longer have Confucius' grave in China because this was destroyed by China during Cultural Revolution. So anyway, in the aftermath of China's occupation of Tibet, 150,000 Tibetans came into exile, following His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And then one of the things that the exile government did in India with the support from the Indian government is to start schools. So with the schools came Hindi and English, and then a new kind of style of writing came into Tibetan system, largely influenced by now outsides, not because we wanted, but because we were forced to. For example, the fact that I speak English has nothing to do with my own freedom, because I was taken to exile when I was about 11 years old. Then I had to learn English. I had no choice. So this is a language that came to me not out of my own choice, but because of the circumstances that forced me to. So for many Tibetans who came in the aftermath of being forced into exile, English became a kind of a language that we, not only English actually, Hindi to some extent, we had to learn Hindi and English because that's the survival language. If you are to survive in India, you need Hindi. And if you have to go somewhere else, you need English. So for any Tibetan living now, Tibetan, English and Hindi are necessary. Then after about 10 years, in about 1970s, maybe mid-1970s, when Tibetans learned enough English, they started writing in English. And this is something that I wanted to focus on when we talk about Tibetan literature sources, because Tibetan literature sources in Tibetan is huge. I mean, I have no expertise in talk about that. I have no authority whatsoever. I think some estimated that the amount of translation that Tibetan initiated from Sanskrit to Tibetan is 70 million words or something. So you can imagine the amount of resources that the Tibetans spent just in the act of translation. 70 million words from Sanskrit, Pali and other languages into Tibetan over the centuries. So anyway, so when we talk about literature sources, as you know very well, there's primary sources, then there are secondary sources, then there are, to some extent, tertiary or the third sources. Anyway, so I don't really want to focus on the secondary sources because there's also a problem. Until, as I said, when we came into exile, we never wrote about our own experience. Buddhism teaches you this fundamental belief to be kind, to treat everybody else above you, which means to some extent you subdue yourself. So even in the act of writing, for example, you don't do it because you want to express your own feelings and anger and frustration. You do it because you wanted to, the act of writing has to help somebody else, which means that has to do with the endeavor to bring somebody else's happiness. So for hundreds of years, Tibetans never really bothered to write about themselves. That's why if you look at the Tibetan literature before 1959, you will hardly ever come which has to do with the love, hate, war, and what you like and what you don't like, human affairs. It has to do with the Buddhist philosophy and promotion of Buddhism and Buddhist philosophy. So anyway, so now in the aftermath of coming into exile, then all of a sudden we were bombarded by this question of how do we make ourselves clear to the world. And one way that we found that is useful is to tell our stories as things we experience every day. And this, I think, Tibetans learned very late. Even now, when Tibetans, especially in the monastic and religious institutions, the self is still suppressed to some extent. So when you engage in Buddhist in dialogues with the, for example, monks and nuns, self is always, at the base level. For example, there is a great Tibetan scholar called I forget his name. Lotsawa Rinchen Sangpo, who catalogued 250 volumes of Kanyu and 110 volumes of Tenyu. So he was a great scholar. There's a myth that he was going around a stupa. Each stupa has a four side, right? So at each corner he would keep a secretary, and then he walks around, and simultaneously he was dictating 4 books at a time. But at the end of each book, he would say that I'm nothing, I'm nobody. Everything that I write, everything that I do is for the promotion of Buddhism, for the Dharma, for others. I am nothing. So this is the kind of attitude that we are imbibed for hundreds of years. So anyway, so now coming to the primary sources of Tibetan literature, particularly in English, which I think is of some interest to you, there are autobiographies, a whole lot of autobiographies, including one by His Holiness the Dalai Lama called My Land and My People. I think this is a book that any Tibetan, anybody who want to understand about Tibet and Tibetan people must read. He wrote this book when he was 25, at the age of 25, and this book he wrote in 1959 and early 1960. His Holiness was around 25 at the time. And this book is absolutely based on his own experience, how he came across China, how he took political responsibility, how his experience was when he was escaping from Tibet, crossing the Himalayan mountains in 1959. So this is one book. And then his second autobiography, Freedom and Exile, is also really good. These are primary sources, autobiography. Then there is a book called Born in Tibet by Chogyam Trungpa. There is a Fire Undersnow political account of Pandey Gyatso, written in collaboration with Tsering Shakya, who's a Tibetan scholar teaching at University of British Columbia. And we have hundreds of accounts of former political prisoners as well. So this is one primary source. And the second primary source that I wanted to focus now, I think, is fiction. Since we came into exile, Tibetans have published only 8 novels. And so first novel was published in 1966, written by a Tibetan doctor